this video I'm going to show you how to do a BMS swap on a Hadean Bamboo battery. To do this swap you'll need some tools. You need a Phillips head screwdriver, you need a 1/8 Allen key, you need a small plastic spudger for applying sealant, you'll need some tweezers, and you'll need some electrical sealant. The one we use is Dowsil 738 electrical sealant. So first things first, battery is removed from the board, makes it a whole lot easier to work on. Allows us to access the inside. So we will need to disassemble the battery completely to access the BMS on this one. So we'll start by flipping the battery over so we can access the battery case screws. Using our 1/8 Allen key, we'll remove the 20-ish screws that are fastening that one to the battery case. Okay, now we've got those screws removed, we can remove the lid off the battery case. Now sometimes it does get a little bit stuck on the motor controller end. It's just sealant that's used on the terminals of the battery PCB, so you can just pull it up and then through it. There we go, pop that one off to the side. So this exposes our battery PCB underneath. Now there's quite a few connections here that we need to disconnect before we can remove the battery completely from the case. So I start with the front end of the battery. We want to lift the PCB up and out of the case, just bending it. It is made to bend. We want to disconnect the front LED plug, let that one go back down. So now working on the rear end, we've got 3 connectors to disconnect on the rear of the PCB, and then we'll need to disconnect the charge port as well. So I'll start with the switch connector, tweezer these aside and just carefully work that one out. Second connector out. And then the last one is the connector for the rear LED PCB. That one's a bit bigger. I like to go either side of it to work it out, and it will just pop out. Now to access the charge port connector, I like to partially remove the PCB from the battery case. So again, starting at the front, lifting it up out of the case, and then slightly shift it forward to expose that connector. And we can pull that one out and disconnect it. So the battery PCB is now completely separate from the battery case. So we can pull that one up and away, flipping it over, pop your battery case to the side. So now we've got access to the BMS and the 4 screws that attach it to the PCB. So to remove the BMS, we're just going to remove those 4 screws. Phillips head screwdriver, we need to push through the sealant that's on top of those screws. Okay, now we've got those 4 screws removed, we can simply lift the BMS up off the PCB. Now as we do this, we want to lift it straight up so that we don't damage any of the pins that run from the BMS into the battery PCB. So grabbing it from both ends, giving it a wiggle, and that'll release it from the PCB. So now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our replacement BMS. So essentially the same process in reverse order. So first thing being putting the BMS back onto the PCB. So again, we want to make sure we line up all these connectors with the connectors on the battery PCB. Once you can feel they're lined up, you can have a look to make sure they're lined up properly. Simply push the BMS down to seat it. Holding it in place, we're going to reinstall those 4 screws. Make sure these 2 screws are sufficiently tight because they do carry power through there. Okay, now we've got the BMS back on the PCB of the battery. We're going to reinstall it back into our battery case. So we'll start by moving some of these wires out of the way, just to make sure we don't crush anything as we place it back in. So once they're all clear, place the battery PCB into the battery case, starting at the front end. I like to leave it sitting up a little bit. Sometimes it can help to reconnect the charge port. So I do that one first. Once the charge port's connected, we want to tuck it up under the BMS. Just like that, and let that sit back down. So we'll get our tweezers again, and we're going to reconnect the 3 connectors at the end here, starting with the switch connector. Second connector, and then finally the rear LED PCB connector. So that's those ones sorted at the rear end. We'll move back to the front end to connect the front LED PCB. So as we did when removing it, we want to lift the PCB up out of the case, plug that connector in. Can only go in one way. You'll see the cables route back down into the little channel there. Make sure it's lined up and nothing's being pinched. Okay, now we want to put the battery case lid back on. making sure you got it the right way around. It can only go on one way. Now, there's a lot of screw holes here, but we're only going to be using about half of them when we're reinstalling these screws. The ones that these screws go into are the ones that have a more defined countersink hole, so stick to those ones. Using our 1/8 Allen key, tighten those ones up. These ones don't need to be too tight. You'll find if you tighten them down too much, it will start to bulge on the edge of the battery case lid there. Okay, so we've got that battery case lid secured. We'll flip it back over. Next thing we'll do now is we'll just check that the battery's turning on. Now, because there's no motor controller installed, we're not going to get any LED lights flashing to indicate that it's switched on. There is a small red LED positioned between the BMS and the battery PCB, which is visible when you turn the battery on. So that one's all working as it should. So final thing we're going to do is we're going to apply some of this electrical sealant to the small connectors that we removed during the disassembly. They are quite fragile small connectors, so it is important to put this sealant on there to make sure they don't vibrate loose in use. I use a small plastic spudger. Just put a small amount on the tip. You can see on the connectors where there was previously silicone sealant. So just a small smear over that same spot is all that's needed. And a little bit onto the LED plug as well. And that one's all finished. And that's how you replace a BMS on a Bamboo Hadean battery.